Hello, welcome to the G.I. Joe New News Review. I am David Allen. The following content was originally intended for the G.I. Joe fan club, but due to unforeseen circumstances, this content will no longer be used in that venue. And so I wanted to share them with you here. I hope you enjoy. Hello, welcome to another episode of G.I. Joe Fan Club Live. I am David Allen. I am joined by my two co-hosts, Jason Morrell, the host of Order of Battle podcast, and James Kavanaugh Jr., the author of the RAHC guide and the Rank and File guides, and he's the head of the new G.I. Joe Fan Club. And our special guest joining us this episode to talk about all things G.I. Joe animation is Buzz Dixen. Thank you for joining us, Buzz.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be here, Dave.
Well, trust me, it's our pleasure, probably more than it is yours, because we love your work. And we spoke a while back, and as I said before, you created our childhoods, basically, and the beginning of your website, the Buzz Dixen, your friend put that on there, and it's the truth. You've written something to do with almost every single cartoon series I have in this theater of mine, and that's my childhood.
Well, I don't know whether to accept the compliment or the blame. Yeah, I had a blast doing it. I enjoyed doing it. I worked with some really great people. And it's one of those things that when you look at it in the rearview mirror, you go, wow, there was a lot of stuff done in a lot of different places. So I'm very thankful people still remember it fondly.
So I'm going to ask the first questions, and then I will let it pass around to the other guys, because I don't want to monopolize this opportunity. So the first question I want to ask is a kind of a technical question. Can you break down what a episode of G.I. Joe the Animated Series, from an inception, an idea in your head, to it airing on syndicated television? Can you break that down for us?
Well, the train would go pretty much like this. You come up with an idea. You pitch it to Sunbow, the guy Tom and Joe Bacall, and they would get it approved by Hasbro. And that usually would, that was a very fast turnaround, often in the same day. You just ask them, I want to do a story where, Shipwreck is a technical advisor on a G.I. Joe movie. And they go, okay, fine. Then you do up a short pitch on it, a short presentation, which could be anywhere from 1 to 3 pages long, where you basically lay out the parameters of the story, what it's going to involve. That would go up all the way to Hasbro. Hasbro typically signed off on it. I'll be very honest, I can't remember them ever rejecting something once it got in the story stage. They might ask for changes, but they never rejected. And then past that point, you went to work on the script. And depending upon what the schedule was, depending upon whether you were working with a freelance writer or somebody in-house, you could get a script done usually in about a week's time. Okay. Because once we got used to the rhythm of writing for these shows, it was pretty easy, to get your mind into G.I. Joe or Transformers or even My Little Pony mode and be able to write one of these scripts fairly fast. We had some freelancers that took anywhere from 2 weeks to a month, but that was fine. We were not depending on them for, to keep the coffers filled daily. We were using them basically to buy us time further down the road. So after that, it would go to back to Hasbro to be approved. Once Hasbro approved it or made any changes, They went over to Marvel Productions, where their storyboard department and their layout department got to work on it. Now, what would happen would be the storyboard department is off actually drawing what the story will look like. But the layout department is getting the storyboards, and they are breaking down what it's actually going to look like. You get very rough drawings in the storyboard department, but the layout department actually has to design the backgrounds. They have to design the vehicles, everything else. And there were artists who were specialists in this. They had guys who did nothing but character design, vehicle design, stuff like that. Then it went to the animators, and the animators could either be in the United States or they could be overseas. We had at one point, I think, 3 different animation companies working for us, including Marvel, and 2 of them were overseas, because once the animation, I'm going to get a little technical here, so forgive me.
Go on.
Animation could be done on 1s or 2s, and very rarely on 3s, almost never beyond that. And what we mean is, when you do it on 1s, for 1 second of action, that's 24 frames a second in the old film style. That's 24 frames a second, and you do 24 frames of movement, so it's completely smooth. But for a lot of things for television, you could do it on 2s. So you do it on 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, like that, and you just double it. And for most stuff like dialogue or characters just walking along or vehicles where you don't really need ultra smooth animation, you could do that. You could get you get it done by on 2s. Very rarely would they call for it on 3s, and unless it was Deke or John Crisfalucci, almost never on 4s or 6s. Those guys. I mean, Crisfalucci was doing it deliberately. He was doing it as a style, but Deke was just trying to hide the fact they couldn't animate. Anyway, at the same time that's going on, the dialogue is being recorded. The soundtrack is being constructed, which includes music, which typically mostly came from a library of music cues we already had existing. The recording session was done. Wally Burr would be the voice director. We'd call in the actors. We would voice act the show in one day. And we tried to do it not with everybody recording at the same time, but everybody in the studio, so they could hear what the flow of the story was, so they could understand, I'm going to be responding to Roadblock, and Roadblock sounds like he's amused at this point. So I have to remember that Roadblock is amused, so I don't have to be angry or something else. I need to respond to that. And Wally was really good about guiding performances and reminding people, where they were, right now you're on a cliff, so, you don't want to sound too brave. You got to sound a little shaky here, things like that. Then the soundtrack is all put together, sound effects, music, and dialogue. And these are 3 separate tracks, or they were in the old days. I don't know about now, but it was 3 separate tracks, because when the show would go overseas, they would remove the voice track and then lay in a new voice track if it was being dubbed in another language. The animation would come back. They would show it to us. We would react in horror and, ask for, fixes occasionally. I mean, I see errors that got through in these cartoons all the time, and it was simply because we didn't have the time to fix every single problem. I'll give you one example that we had to fix, and it was luckily just in the storyboard stage. I wrote a script where the Dreadnoks are standing in the middle. They're standing on a airstrip, and they're arguing among themselves. And so I think it was Torch and Ripper are arguing with each other. I may have it wrong. and they're arguing back and forth, and Buzzer is standing there, and he doesn't say anything for the first part of the argument. And in the script I wrote, Buzzer now sticks his oar in the water, meaning he joins the argument, and he would say something. Well, he goes to the animation department, and these guys are reading it literally. So they get to that point, and he sticks his oar in the water. Okay, I guess there's a creek running across the airfield, and he's got an oar.
Oh, jeez.
That's not what we meant, guys. We had, I don't recall necessarily on G.I. Joe, but I know on other shows I worked on, character would supposed to be going up or down a flight of stairs, and the animators would have them oriented the wrong way. So let me show you. Instead of coming down the stairs like this, he's coming down the stairs like this.
Oh, jeez.
When it was absolutely you have to get it fixed, you get it fixed. But if it was something minor, like you forgot to give this character his regular weapon or something like that in this particular shot, it's like it's not worth it. Just let it go and hope nobody notices. They all noticed.
Sorry, there was a lot of errors. I remember watching the cartoon. There was a lot of color errors, like
oh my god,
pants were the wrong color. Serpentor was the wrong. This guy was supposed to be a white guy, and he was a African guy. Things like that I saw, but it was only like half a frame, like really super fast.
Yeah, because as I said, normally they were very good about this. They were very good in the checking. What you see were the most minor mistakes that got by. And as I said, if it was something really, serious, well, we'd have to call for reanimation or retake. But if it was a minor thing like the wrong color or Sarge's hat, they could never keep Sarge's hat on model. I mean, it just, in one scene from one shot to another, it's changing shape and size. And at a certain point, we just threw up our hands and said, as long as it's roughly the same design, we're not going to say anything about it.
Was any part of this mentality going with the transition from being broadcast live, and that's the end of it, to starting the age of like VHS and home, i.e. rewatching? Because I don't think people would catch as much as what we caught in the 50s, 60s, 70s. But now that you're able to rewatch it and record and watch it over and over like we did, hey.
Definitely, if you're watching it, definitely if you're watching it over and over. I mean, because that happens with any movie.
Sure.
Our family tradition is to watch White Christmas at Christmas time, and there's one scene where if you keep your eyes open with Vera, what's her name, Vera Lynn, and anyway, the two female leads, they've got a coffee pot, a transparent coffee pot, and the level of the coffee goes up and down throughout the scene because nobody kept track of that. They keep pouring the coffee and redoing the scene, and nobody filled the coffee back to the same level. So you've got little continuity errors like that, and you do spot them when you watch them again and again. But also, we just had a lot of really sharp-eyed fans watching this thing and asking us all kinds of questions and stuff, and half the time we get a question is like, I don't know, what I tell people, one of the advantages of being the original on the original writing team for these shows was you'd be sitting there working on a script and you'd go, is Roadblock a Rhodes Scholar? He is now. Who's going to say no to you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Go with it.
Did you have a question, James?
Oh,
I can. Sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess two quick follow-up questions. You mentioned the ones, the twos, the threes. How would you fill in those in between spaces with any sort of gap, or would you just time the sellout?
You just double click.
Okay,
sure. So if you had 24 frames in full animation, Disney animation, you would have 24 hand-drawn cells. In TV animation, you would have 12 hand-drawn cells. And so the first cell would be held for frames 1 and 2, the second cell for frames 3 and 4, the third one 5 and 6, and so on. And so you just, as I said, as long as it didn't have to be really smooth, as long as it wasn't a very violent, when I say violent, I mean in a lot of motion.
Oh, sure.
As long as it wasn't a very vigorous, that might be a better word. As long as it wasn't a very vigorous bit of animation, we could get by with 2s and a lot of stuff.
Jason?
Excellent.
Jason, you have a question?
Oh, I'm sure I do.
Go ahead.
I mean, what you're talking about here isn't just, I mean, G.I. Joe and Transformers are obviously the longer of the lived shows, but I mean, that's not, I mean, Dungeons and Dragons and Rescue Rangers and all these others, I mean, they've all been this same sort of impact on us. Do you often encounter the communities of these other shows, or is it just us Joe guys that are rabidly knocking on your door for all this information?
The Joe and Transformer fans seem to be the most enthusiastic, but I have heard quite a bit from Gem fans, not so much from Pony fans, because to be honest, the Pony phenomenon, the bronies, came along in a generation after we had worked on it. I mean, I'm very happy to have worked on the show. It was fun because, after a while, you just get tired of robots bashing each other and Cobra and Joe, and you go like, let's go help the ponies find the magical 4-leaf clover. Okay, that'll be a nice change of palette for a while. We get a few requests for like Visionaries. They have a very strong fandom.
It's a great cartoon.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We tried our best with that. We get some Inhumanoid fans because there are people who remember Inhumanoids. And of all the shows we did, that's the one where we get the most questions. Are they ever going to bring it back? And all I could say is I would encourage them, because I think at the time they made some marketing mistakes that they recognized at the time. But it was kind of like the Little Ponies. I don't know if you recall, but the original My Little Pony was about this big, and the pitch was that the little girls could brush the mane and brush the tail and do all this stuff with it. And
I do remember.
When they revamped it for TV animation, they became these little toys, which is much better, I think. I mean, because, the big one was like a weapon. You could hang somebody. I had 2 daughters. We had a My Little Pony, and it posed a threat. Let's just put it that way.
I had a sister. It posed a threat.
Yeah. And, if somebody at Hasbro were to say, maybe if this time we don't make the Inhumanoids so flippin' big, so they can be done cheaper, we can bring them back as a series or something. So,
it's a fragile toy line as well.
If anybody wants to do that.
Nowadays we have a thing. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the toy market today. We have a thing called a Build-A-Figure. You could have did the characters, the smaller characters, and then had a piece with each one that they built that monster, and then you wouldn't have had to sell it for $50 or whatever the price was in the 80s.
No, there's a lot that they could do with it to revamp it and bring it back. Now, like I said, I wish them well. I mean, I'm not doing animation anymore, but if somebody at Hasbro thinks, well, yeah, why don't we bring them back? Go for it. I mean, we had fun doing it.
There was an attempt by Hasbro and IDW Comics to create a continuity-based universe of Hasbro properties. Inhumanoids was part of that initiative, and there were connections to Inhumanoids in that initiative. And I think they were moving towards that. There was some rumor of a movie at one point. I don't know how far along it went, but there was some rumor of an Inhumanoids connection in that Hasbro universe. But alas, it never came to be, and that's just the way it goes with this sort of stuff. I have a question about the timing of production. Now, you talked about the how an idea to an animated episode gets made. You and I spoke before, but I'd like you to explain to these guys. It takes what, like a year from inception to the television, from over and overseas and everything, and back and forth.
Depends. It depends on what we're measuring and how. If, for example, when GI Joe started, from the moment Hasbro said, yeah, we're going to do this, and they formed Sunbow with the Griffin Bacall advertising agency and told them, go out and get an animation company and get creative staff and go to work. From that moment until the show actually launched, yeah, roughly a year. When we were actually in production and everything was chugging along at full speed, 6 to 8 weeks from writing, from turning the script in to getting the final cut that we would approve. And once we approved it, it went in the hopper. And then it could go on the air in as little as 1 week or as long as 3 or 4 weeks, depending upon how many we had, how much of a cushion we had. Because every now and then, you start getting a little nervous. You're not, you recognize, wow, we're only like 3 stories ahead. We better get a few more done real quick. We had to crank these things out. Remember, you were watching them at a rate of 1 a day during the week. And we had to get these things out at roughly the same pace.
Wow.
Maybe not exactly 1 a day, but we had to turn out a lot of stuff in 1 week's time. We had to, we would have premises coming in, we would have outlines being written, scripts being written, storyboards being done, animation being done. We'd have like 6 or 8 shows in one step of production or the other at any given moment. Had big boards up in the conference room that, keeping track of everything. Well, hello, who's that, Jason?
This is my son, Alexander.
Hello, Alexander. How are you? Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So anyway, when we were going full bore, 6 to 8 weeks from story approval to finished episode. And obviously the earlier episodes obviously took a lot longer because we're kind of figuring out what we're doing. Hasbro is giving more, attention to what's being done. Going back to Inhumanoids for a moment, they canceled the toy line halfway through the season. And when they did, we asked them, well, does this mean the show is canceled? And they said, no, we have a commitment to do, all these episodes. You guys, as long as we don't get any complaints from the FCC, do whatever you want. And we go, oh, really? And they were pretty much hands off at that point. I mean, as long as it, didn't get us hauled into court, okay, go ahead.
Well, that actually leads into the question I wanted to ask. Yeah, you mentioned the people disproportionately clamoring for Inhumanoids, and not to make it Inhumanoid Hour with the G.I. Joe fan club, but if I remember the storyline correctly, what you're kind of getting at, it was a little more adult themed. It was a little more tangible. It wasn't kid gloves. Let's just say that. And I was just kind of curious about your thoughts on that, and in general, even with G.I. Joe. I mean, one episode you had currency manipulation, and another episode, there was sea serpents and ghosts and all these wacky toy-esque, concepts to bring into a child's cartoon or kid-esque, concepts. But at the same time, all your stories were really pulling some adult current event type concepts.
We did not ever write down to kids.
Yeah.
And because we remembered when we were kids, the shows that we liked were the ones that didn't try to talk down to us. We were not interested in doing romper rube type stuff. And when we were writing the shows, we were asking ourselves, what would we be interested in watching at that age? And as a result, we were finding things, all kinds of stuff to delve into, all kinds of ideas. We also the creative staff came from a very eclectic background. I mean, you got Flint Dilley was one of the chief writers on Transformers. He also did a number of GI Joes. Flint is literally a classically trained scholar. I mean, he's like one dissertation away from a PhD in ancient history. And so
Okay.
he was like bubbling over with philosophical and ancient history concepts and ideas. And I'm just like a grab bag for anything that comes floating along, and any wild idea that comes bouncing down the pike, I'll take a look at it. Steve Gerber, I mean, very well read. I mean, everybody who worked on the show was well read, had broad interests, had a very deep background, and we just didn't want to crank it out. I'm going to say something, and I'm not saying it to denigrate the show, because I know Super Friends had a lot of fans, and I know they very deliberately crafted the show in a certain way, but the Super Friends stuff always struck me as being too light, too silly, too flimsy. And, Steve and I worked on the Thundar the Barbarian show at Ruby Spears, and we never, wrote down on that show. I mean, we were going full bore Howard as best we could. We were trying to do our best barbarian fantasy possible.
I remember that being weird, and I was too young to put my finger on it. But yes, absolutely, yeah. I mean, you're right. Go on. I'm sorry.
Look, my God, you had me, you had Steve, Marty Pascoe was doing it. We had a bunch of other great writers, including Mark Evanier. We had Jack Kirby designing the show for us. I mean, for heaven's sakes, it was, and on top of that, my God, I'll mention a guy's name you've never heard of, a guy named John Dorman. He was the head of the storyboard department at Ruby Spears. John assembled this incredible talent pool of storyboard artists, including guys like Dan Reba, Kurt Connors, and a guy, well, here, let me see if I got his book here.
Nice.
That's what I like.
But anyway, we had just like this incredible talent, mind-boggling, good workers there, and just it was a nutty environment too, because we were working for Joe Ruby, and I love Joe, but my God, you talk about a crazy imagination. Joe had it, but again, never ever write down. Even the little ponies we did, we would try to keep the stories simple, but we never made them simplistic. We never made them, we had a lot of silly fun with them, but we never wrote down to it.
Jason,
Oh, absolutely.
Jason, you have a question?
I mean, I'm just taking it in. So Alexander just joined us. He's 11. He's watched all of the Transformers and the G.I. Joe cartoons. Just 2 days ago, he had a friend over, and he was showing a friend the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon. And so these aren't just all of us in our middle age fawning over what you did 40 years ago, but it still resonates with,
Thank you.
I mean, with kids with imagination. And they're watching Dungeons and Dragons, and they're trying to figure out the riddle in the show. And when you talk about not writing down to kids, like, that is a goofy, silly cartoon. And the minute the friend is over and he goes, "The Cavalier is a coward," that doesn't make sense. And I was like, that's the point. Just watch. These things live well beyond us. They're still resonating with anybody who's willing to give them a shot. And when he was standing here, I was muted, and I kind of mentioned that you had worked on Chip and Dale's Rescue Rangers, and he left the room singing the theme song.
Oh,
So
thank you.
that is definitely one of those songs that in the middle of conversation, he'll just lean over and go, and he'll start saying the lyrics to me line after line. Just, Dad, sometimes some crimes, they go slipping through the cracks, and you're just like, all right, man. So I don't really have a question. I'm just kind of
Jim Woodring. That was the name I was blanking on. Jim Woodring does. If you're familiar with the name, he does these great but weird comic books, and we had him working for us on Thundar. So I mean, just really incredible thing. And thank you for the kind words on Dungeons and Dragons, because for me, Dungeons and Dragons marked an important step in my writing career. As much as we were trying to make Thundar, a really good barbarian fantasy story, Ruby Spears wouldn't let us tackle, I won't say themes, but they wouldn't let us get too emotionally complex. Everything had to be pretty simple. The good guys are always good guys. The bad guys are always bad guys. And with Dungeons and Dragons, I had my first chance to do a villain who had an understandable motive, and kids watching it go, well, yeah, I guess if I was changed into a living skeleton, I would do almost anything to get turned back to normal. And it was great to be able to write a more emotionally complex character. By the time I got to the traitor on G.I. Joe, I flipped that story. And in G.I. Joe, it's like, well, a hero betraying the Joes? Well, maybe if my mom was sick and I needed the money to take care of her, I might do that, and it gave kids something to think about. It wasn't just here, buy this toy, and move on.
But that's a natural. Oh, sorry, James. Go ahead.
Oh no, well, I was just gonna vocalizing absolutely. I'm following with you, but I do actually have a follow up. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Hasbro probably were pretty, like you said, pretty hands off. They weren't micromanaging all these little things. Did any of that? Did any of this happen to be loosened or expand your opportunities when they deregulated the cartoons with toy correlation? Is that did that factor in at all? Or?
Well, you have to understand the history here. I'll give it very briefly. In the late 60s, there was an animated show called Hot Wheels, and some parents group complained about it, saying it was basically a half-hour animated commercial. And the FCC agreed with them and issued an edict that there could be no toy-based animated shows. Or any children's show for that matter. If you had original characters that then had toys that came along, that was fine. If you based your program on a book or a comic book or something else, and then a toy line was introduced later, that was fine. So what happened was a few years later, the Smurfs hit America, and they hit them first as these little tchotchkes, these little like key rings and stuff like that. And nobody really knew what they were. They were just like really cute little toys to have. And somebody, I think it was Hanna-Barbera. Yeah. Hanna-Barbera said, wow, if only we could do an animated show on this, but we can't because they're toys. And someone who was a little more knowledgeable said, well, no, they're based on a Belgian comic book. And you go, oh, really? Oh. So they developed the show.
The Florida boss.
Yeah. When, NBC bought it, the FCC said, you can't put this on the air. It's a toy show. And they said, no, look, Belgian comic book. And they go, well, okay. At that point, the people who had the Strawberry Shortcake license said, well, do greeting cards count as printed material? Because they had toys lined up to come out. And the FCC goes, yeah, printing cards are greeting cards are printed material. So they do a series of strawberry shortcake specials, and then they release the toys. Well, Mattel wants to do He-Man. They go to DC and they get a 3-issue miniseries that bears no resemblance to the actual show. They at least had something they could point to and say, oh, we're basing the show on the comic book. Marvel and Hasbro did the same thing with Transformers and G.I. Joe. And by that point, the syndicated market was taking off, and the FCC just pretty much said, well, it's no longer the same situation you had when you only had 3 networks. Yeah, fine. You know, the suspending the rule, do whatever you want. And the good news about it was that we got a lot of good animation out for a couple of years. The bad news was that it ended up flooding the market as everybody wanted to get their toy line an animated show. And to be brutally frank, not all the toy lines deserved animated shows.
Sure.
Not all the animated shows deserved a chance to be on the market. So.
And then
But
some
now-
animated shows like Dungeons and Dragons, they had a toy line that didn't match the cartoon.
It was-
But
Yeah.
now, I don't know if you've seen in the last couple of weeks, they've been putting out action figures based on your Dungeons and Dragons cartoon,
well,
and they're
doing
quite
a movie.
wonderful.
They're doing a live action movie based on that cartoon. It's identical. Literally, the characters
Oh,
come to
wow.
life in reality.
Wow.
Did you see the Brazilian commercial they did a
Oh,
few
yeah.
years ago? Yeah, that's
I like
fantastic.
that a lot. Yeah.
Oh, sure. That had to have been a nice feather in your cap.
Yeah.
To see your stuff come to life.
Oh, it was. I mean, it was a delight to see, and not directly related to anything I worked on, but I've also seen the live action Wacky Races commercial.
Oh,
Oh, wow.
It's a
Yeah, they're
car
funny.
commercial, and the car is competing against live action
Cars.
Wacky Races vehicles. I saw that and I thought, man, are they missing a bet by not making a feature-length Wacky Races movie?
Don't
sure.
put it past them. Hanna-Barbera has milked Wacky Races quite a lot. I would not put it
Yeah.
past them. They put out new models. There's been cartoon after cartoon. There's probably 15 different variations of Wacky Racers cartoons.
I'm sure because Hanna-Barbera as a production company no longer exists, but
Well,
they're owned
Warner
by
Brothers.
Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers, at some point will figure it out.
Yeah.
And
Because
go
of-
back to Thundar for a minute, because I do get questions on this. People say, why won't they bring Thundar back? And the simple answer is you have to find out who it is at Warner Brothers who will profit off of Thundar coming back. There has to be somebody who it will be a feather in their cap, bring Thundar back and have it be a hit. And you have to find that person and convince them Thundar will be a big hit for you if you bring it back. Because without that, they have no motive to relaunch this stuff.
So I want to go back
Well-
into a little bit of what you were saying earlier about the FCC and the whole thing with the kids and stuff like that, because a lot of shows in the 80s had the PSAs at the end of the cartoons.
Mhm.
Masters of the Universe, obviously, the Super Friends, G.I. Joe had it, Thundercats had it, Silverhawks had it. There was a lot of that stuff. Was that a byproduct of the reversal of the FCC changing that whole thing, or was there another reason?
It was an attempt at insurance to protect the shows from getting some parent group riled up against us and wanting to have us banned, to say, oh, well, we have these public service announcements where, we tell people, we tell kids don't play with firecrackers, don't play with matches, stranger danger warnings, things like that. Which, I'm sure if even only a handful of kids were spared some problem because they remembered something they saw and avoided a situation that could have got them hurt, well, good. I'm glad we did those. I never worked on any of the PSAs because about halfway through G.I. Joe, Hasbro asked us, they said, we're running out of ideas for PSAs. do you guys have any ideas? And I said, well, we are a military show, so we ought to do some military-oriented PSAs. Like, kids, when you're making a Molotov cocktail, make sure there's a quarter of the bottle is filled with powdered soap because you want it to stick to the target when you hit. And they go, right, we're not going to ask you again.
Hold on, let me write this down.
That's one way to get out of it. And
Yeah.
actually, that's the funny thing. You're talking about these parent groups and everything. We live in the Facebook social media era where everybody's complaining about, the next generation and the next generation and the next generation is always soft. But when we were kids, parents were still writing into TV shows. And I mean, how much of an impact was that? Because we hear a lot about it, but was it really that impactful day to day?
Day to day, not necessarily, but when it happened, it occupied a large amount of time. I wrote one Joe script. I think it was called My Brother's Keeper. I may be misremembering, where at the end, the show involved two brothers who were kind of like feuding with each other or at odds with each other. And at the end of the show, they made their peace with each other. And one of the brothers put his hand on the other brother's shoulder. And some father in Pennsylvania came in just at that moment and was immediately convinced we were pushing, gay propaganda. And of course, you've heard the stories about Optimus Prime dying. And,
Right.
I understand the parental reaction to that, okay? Because I can put myself in the parent's position. The Transformers movie was aimed at a younger audience than the G.I. Joe movie. And a lot of those kids needed to go to the theater with their parents. So you've got to imagine you've got these parents in a theater watching a movie that to them looks like an LSD hallucination. This thunderously loud soundtrack that the dialogue might as well be in High Martian for all they can understand what's going on. And then all of a sudden, every kid in the theater starts screaming and crying. And they're going, what happened? And Optimus Prime is dead. And we got a huge feedback from that. And Hasbro said, because we were originally going to kill Duke off in the G.I. Joe movie, Hasbro said, Duke's in a coma and he'll recover at the end of the movie. And I was going, you want to get rid of him? Get rid of him. This is, our audience will understand it. Our audience, no, we're not doing that.
I remember I was Alexander's age when the Transformers movie hit, and like I didn't cry and scream in the theater, but it was emotional.
Yeah.
And I remembered it, and it stuck with me for years. And I, for years, had a cassette tape that I recorded the Transformers theme songs on a boombox next to the TV speaker because what you did. I just find it funny, like how reactionary parents have always been.
Oh yeah.
Pre-internet, they were still doing it. We just focus on it now.
You go all the way back to the 19th century, and there are parents complaining about dime novels. Why are these kids reading these cowboy and Indian stories? Why don't they read classic literature? Why don't they read the Bible? Why don't they go out and milk the cows? Do something productive. I'm sure, and interesting point. I'm sure this goes back all the way to Neolithic days because they had done handprint analysis of these hands that they have found on the walls of caves where there are cave paintings. And they figured out these were not adult handprints. These were children's handprints. So I'm sure there was some adult Neanderthal back then. What are you doing back there looking at cave paintings? Get out here and hunt buffalo,
Well, I don't know how your incestual gay agenda worked out, but we did love the cartoon.
Okay.
Well, now I'm curious how much that affected with the Transformers being in theater, but the G.I. Joe being at home. Because in a sense where
that was it. That was
those kids. Well, I know obviously it reduced. I don't think the box office did that great, but I wonder how much of the. I'm curious to know how much of it was factored in that if those kids were all sitting by themselves and Optimus Prime died, they wouldn't have reacted as bad. But because they're all kind of sitting, something tells me it snowballed in the theater to create a larger problem than it normally was. When a kid falls. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
It definitely created a larger problem, but the real reason the Joe movie didn't get into theaters was Hasbro had a deal with Dino De Laurentiis that he would distribute all three of the Sunbow movies: My Little Pony, G.I. Joe, My Little Pony, Transformers, and G.I. Joe. And De Laurentiis promised 5 screenings every weekend, 3 on Saturday and 2 on Sunday, because at the time animation wasn't popular enough among adults that they could show it all week long. So it was reduced to Saturday and Sunday matinees. Okay. And De Laurentiis couldn't deliver. He couldn't get the theaters to show it 5 times. Instead, they showed it twice on Saturday and once on Sunday. And so that's about like 40% of the projected income has gone. And they got into they being Hasbro and De Laurentiis got into a big tiff about it. And at the last moment, the G.I. Joe movie release was canceled. We had a kind of sneak preview screening at that year's Comic-Con. About 35 years later, the American Cinematheque in Los Angeles at the Egyptian Theater had a double feature of Transformers and the first official big screen screening of G.I. Joe the movie. And then earlier this year, there was the what was it, 40th or so anniversary screening of,
I believe it was the 35th.
35th
for the movie.
Maybe the other one was the 30th anniversary then. But in any case, the 35th anniversary screening of G.I. Joe the movie. And I have to say, when I see it in a theater with fans who are eager to see it and are reacting in the right way to what we wanted to do, I'm very happy with the movie now. There was a period of time when they, for a variety of reasons, because they gutted what I thought was the crucial emotional part of it, Duke's death, and then there were other, I can't really call them mistakes, but things that I would have wished we had done differently, like the Cobra La battle cry. Dick Gautier was a great actor, but he couldn't get his voice high enough for that. When he comes out, Cobra, la 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 la, and it's like, I was in the recording session, and I said to Tom and Joe, I said, please give me 5 minutes, I'll come up with a better battle cry. I said, nah, that's fine, we like it.
Tell this story about when you pitch something and you give them an idea, but you don't give them like 3 to 5 ideas. They go with that idea, and you kind of bemoan that idea because you're like, crap, now I'm stuck with this, and now it's 40 years later, and what am I going to do? Now everybody knows that. Tell that story.
Well, basically what happened was they dropped, at the time they were calling him Cobra Emperor on us for season 2. And they said, yeah, make sure Cobra Emperor has a part in this next script. And I said, Cobra who? And they said, the Cobra Emperor. And I said, well, we just can't introduce the Cobra Emperor without some buildup. We have to know who he is, where he came from. We just can't pretend he was standing just out of camera range all this time. And they go, okay, so come up with a couple of ideas of where he came from. And my mistake was coming up with a couple of ideas, because I wanted to do the DNA story. I thought that would be something that would be really interesting, would be his origin. And I should have just done that. I should have said, well, this is the only idea I have. But instead, I also came up with the Cobra La idea, which was that, he and Cobra Commander were from this ancient civilization, and the ancient civilization was behind Cobra and all this. And Cobra La was meant as a placeholder name, just, not intended to be the actual name of the lost civilization, because it's derived from Shangri-La, which is in James Hilton's Lost Horizon, only the most famous lost civilization in literature. And I begged them. I said, please let me come up with a different name. No, we love it. At one point, we went through at least 4, maybe 6 different names for Serpentor before they finally settled on Serpentor. And at one point they were going to call him King Cobra. And I was going, okay, fine. Let's have a villain who's named after a malt liquor. But then some of the due diligence, and we didn't get to do that.
Probably for the best.
Yeah.
Well, I know that like James and I and my son were sitting next to each other in the theater this summer watching G.I. Joe the movie.
We were all at that showing.
Yeah, you were just a couple rows north of us,
yeah.
David. So it was wonderful that they released it for the 35th. And, I guess you've seen it now a couple times surrounded by fans and everything else. So it's nice that you've been able to see that body of work. In 87, when that came out, I mean, as adults, and you were an adult at the time, so it's easy to bemoan like the silliness of Cobra La, but at 12 years old, I thought that shit was amazing.
Well, thank you.
I didn't at all see a discrepancy from Duke fighting a giant, bipedal snake robot, or reading the brainwave scanner in Larry's comic books to then Cobra La. Like it flowed, and I loved it, and I had the toys, and I just kept rocking.
I'm glad you did.
Yeah.
As I said, my objections at the time were primarily focused on just give me a little bit of time to figure out something better. I can come up with a better name. I can come up with a better battle cry.
Is this where the Most Dangerous Man comes from? Is you coming up with better things?
That's where the Most Dangerous Man in the world got dropped out, so to speak, because I had been developing this idea called the Most Dangerous Man in the World, which was going to be my version of the origin of Cobra. Larry Hama was doing the comic book, but Larry recognized that he couldn't try to match what was going on in the animated series, and we couldn't try to match what he was doing in the comic. So we both kind of recognized, without actually formally discussing it, that we were on, we had like 2 parallel G.I. Joe storylines going. And there were certain similarities and overlaps, but there was not really continuity between the two. And I hope that doesn't disappoint anybody who's out there trying to find every way of tying everything together.
Probably are some people like that, but yeah, we're all realists here.
Yeah.
It's actually kind of the fun part of meeting new collectors and fans is finding out as a child, was your Joe canon derived from Sunbow or from Marvel?
Yeah.
Were you a cartoon Joe guy or a comic Joe guy? I mean, most of us cross that line quite a bit, but everybody has their, like, this is the one that meant the most. And so that's always fun when you meet new people, getting to that point, not just like what was your first figure or your first vehicle, but what informed your world. You informed a lot of worlds.
Yeah, that was, what I was planning to do was to explain how, in my view of things, Cobra came about. And for those who haven't heard this before, my idea was that there was a Cobra philosopher, and he had the basic operating idea for Cobra, but Cobra Commander completely screwed it up. And the philosopher was trying to stop Cobra Commander, and Cobra Commander throws him in a dungeon. And then the philosopher gets away, and Cobra suspends all worldwide operations to track him down, because the last thing Cobra Commander wants is some guy out there telling his people, Cobra Commander's doing it all wrong. You should do it this way. So Hasbro approved that, and then they told me find a place for the Cobra Emperor in this. And if we had not done Cobra Law, which gives us a completely different origin of Cobra, if we had not done Cobra Law, we could have still done the most dangerous man in the world. But because they approved both ideas, that pretty much closed the door on the most dangerous man. But I always liked the story. I always wished I had a chance to do it. And a few years ago, Amazon briefly had a thing going called Kindle Worlds, which was essentially you could write fan fiction for one of about a dozen or so different, fictional universes. And, you could publish it online through Amazon and get paid for it, because the rights holders would get their share and then you would get a share. So I thought, well, this is great. I'll finally write up this story. And I did it as a short novel, The Most Dangerous Man in the World. And, I had about a year before Amazon, pulled the plug on Kindle Worlds. So yeah, if you're looking for it now, sorry, it's no longer available.
So it's not something that you've gone back and washed the Joes out to re-release. It's just your own.
It would
the ROI is low
that it's worth.
Sure.
Because I would have to come up with parallel names, parallel equipment, stuff like this. And right now there's a new comic book company that has the rights to the Joe characters. And I've told people, if you want to write to the comic book company and tell them, hey, do The Most Dangerous Man in the World is the great lost G.I. Joe episode, I'll be delighted to have that conversation with somebody. But
and it's very possible.
We might have put a word out to the fan club.
They just did the Saturday morning adventures, so it's a possibility.
I would
never say no.
I'd be delighted to do it. Delighted to have a talk with anybody who wants to discuss that. But I'm still writing. I'm writing short stories. I'm writing book length manuscripts that I'm trying to find an agent for right now. I'm not writing action adventure. I'm writing more, for lack of a better word, mainstream comedy. I guess that's the only way to describe it. One's a football story, another is a small town story. I've got the one I've just wrapped up is about the early days of television. I'm more focused on those in going forward. I'm not particularly driven to go back and revamp The Most Dangerous Man in the World as an action adventure story and try to get that out there while at the same time I'm trying to get these others out. But as I said, if somebody contacts me and says we'd like to do it, I'll have that conversation. We'll see where that goes.
That would be lovely. Speaking of, writing and everything, I'm every time I'm not speaking, I'm just sort of staring at your background. I'm a book guy, and so I keep picking out different pieces of your library. I like this. How much more is there? Oh, look at that. Nice. That's beautiful.
Yeah. And downstairs we have almost as many books, but these are my books related to things I'm interested in. Downstairs we have the safe for guests to look at books, which are the more they're my wife's books. They're the broader interests, the classical literature, things like that. This is a fraction of what I had at one time. I'm not exaggerating. I had at least 10 times as many books as I have here, and I had just a huge number of magazines. And I just had, when we moved, I just had to trim stuff way back. So
I just went through the trimming process myself. I had adopted 1,500 pounds of books from my grandfather at one point. And so between my library and his, this is a 19-foot wall that was so packed that sometimes you have to. But I do love like all the different pieces between the comics, the art books, the philosophy, everything that's in here.
Thank you.
Yeah. I know that's not a G.I. Joe question. That's just,
Well, no, actually it is, because this range of material here is what we all at Sunbow, we all had this in our background, not necessarily literally everything I've got here, but we all had this broad range of interest. And if one of us started talking about, said, hey, I was reading this book, let's pick a real difficult tome here, The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Well, everybody knew at least what the general idea was on that, about how the human mind evolved over, fairly recently to become a more rational mind instead of a mind that was guided by, voices and spirits. And we could have a discussion about that, and we could find a way of working that into a story of trying to develop ideas from it. Because wherever an idea would come from, we had no shame. The story behind the Viper, of course.
Yeah.
Love that episode.
Steve Gerber, as a joke on Tuesday, said we ought to do a story where this guy is calling up, I'm the Viper, and drives to Joe's Batty, and then at the end it turns out I'm the Viper. I'm here to bite the windows. And we all laughed at it. Well, Friday comes along and we need a script by Monday. And I'm trying to remember who we called. I can't remember if it was Dave Karen or Dave Weiss. I can't remember, but basically, here's the script. Here's the idea. Get it churned out over the weekend and have it on Steve's desk Monday morning. So, wherever the idea would come from.
So, everything you were just talking about reminded me of earlier on, where Dave and Cav both mentioned how G.I. Joe, the cartoon, and Transformers and a few others really didn't talk down to your children audience. And then you bring up the Viper example, which was still...
No. That's different. That's just dumb humor.
Yeah,
dumb
it was
humor
genius.
is different from writing down. Okay.
Yeah. But this example,
that was compelling.
Yeah. But
Just
this
the way
example,
it's sewed through. Go ahead. Sorry, Jason.
yeah, I've really got my teeth into that.
But to Jason's point, G.I. Joe wasn't one thing to one person. It was many things to many different people from that period of time, and it still is today. Rewatching the G.I. Joe feature film, I see different things every time I watch the thing. It's one of those unique things about media and individual people. They take different things out of different things and from different time frames as well, because I'm at another point than I was when I was in the 80s. I was a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid, and now I'm almost 50. And so I'm taking the same material, looking at it from a different set of eyes and experiences, and experiencing it differently myself. That's how unique and how well those scripts and stories and concepts work.
Well, thank you, because that's what we were trying for. We didn't want something that was just going to be, fluff. We didn't want to do what I call the quintessential Super Friends type of story. Joker steals the Eiffel Tower.
We did that in G.I. Joe.
Yeah, but I mean, if we stole the Eiffel Tower in G.I. Joe, we had a purpose for it. We could articulate why we did that. The Joker just does it because it's Tuesday. I mean, no, we did stuff. Yeah, we did stuff. I mean, that just the motivations could come from anywhere. I mean, Lights, Camera, Cobra. I thought we have got to get Shipwreck out on the town. We have got to show him out there. And I thought, well, how do we do that? And then, well, we can do the story where they've captured a Cobra device, but they don't realize what the implications are of it. And Cobra's going to want to get it back, but it's been loaned out for a movie, and Shipwreck has managed to get his way onto the technical advising team, and that gets him into Hollywood and all kinds of trouble. You know, and going back for the jokes, he's flying one of the Cobra pods, and there's a coyote on his, gnawing on his leg, and he kicks the coyote off into a river, and he goes beep beep on the way down. I mean,
Well, I mean, you guys also had Timber the wolf dancing on his hind legs. I mean, you guys definitely put in the jokes, but it is a cartoon that has endeared time and us growing old. And even though we can nitpick as adults that we wouldn't like Cobra Law if it came out today, as children, we loved it. And because of that, I still do. My son loves Cobra Law. He loves all the different aspects that you guys put into G.I. Joe, into Dungeons and Dragons, Transformers, and beyond. I have not shown him Visionaries yet. This is one I need to sit him down in front of, because I loved Visionaries as a kid. There's just, so many things and so much time.
And one other comment, piling on this and to float your boat, just those simple concepts, I didn't care about them when I was in school, talking about all the history and all this. I was a little unruly. I probably should have cared more. I did end up getting a decent education and being all right for myself. But if you guys would talk about it, then it would all of a sudden, or the shows would talk about it, that would intrigue me. Then I'd go and look it up, and I'd actually learn something. So
I've had more than a few people. I've had more than a few people say the first time I ever heard of DNA was on G.I. Joe. Okay. And if all we did was just alert you there is this thing out there called DNA, then you were one step more receptive to learning about it when you encountered it the next time. Like, oh, that was on G.I. Joe. Mm-hmm. And it was something you could connect with.
There's a huge contingent of our community that talk about the different terms and words they learned from Larry's comics and from your guys' cartoon. That is not, for us, the community, that is not new news. So it's good that it's getting back to you of how many of us, like Cav, just ended up picking up an Encyclopedia Britannica back then and looking up things based on G.I. Joe.
Well, that's kind of like my point of origin too, because I was what they call a monster kid back in the 60s. I was reading Famous Monsters magazine. I was reading science fiction digests and things like that. And I was encountering ideas and concepts, for the first time, and making note of them, keeping them, aligned in my head, what they meant, how they interrelated to one another. If I've had people ask me, how do you know this or that or the other thing? And I just tell them, how do you not know it? The information is out there flooding us all the time, 24/7. All you have to do is be receptive to it.
Absolutely.
It's true. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, Buzz? Because you've been doing writing since the 60s, I believe, right?
I was started seriously writing when I was about 13, but I know I had tried to write a script when I was in third grade, and I think I got like 2 pages into it and realized this sucks, and I stopped doing it. And I wrote some short stories for junior high and things like that. But about 12 or 13, I started to seriously get interested in writing because I was reading these science fiction magazines, and I figured I can do that. I want to do that sort of thing. And I didn't have any success professionally, but I ended up getting reviews published in a number of science fiction fanzines, a few articles, things like that. I was drafted in 1972, and the Army, in their infinite wisdom, made me a newspaper editor. So I was able to continue honing my writing practice. Even though I wasn't selling anything, I was at least still able to find time to write, to be creative. And finally, when I got discharged, I had applied to USC's film school, and I was discharged in February of '78, and the film school didn't start until October. So I came out to Los Angeles with my wife and daughter, and I decided I wanted to get a job at a studio as a driver or in the mailroom or a gopher or something like that, just to get my feet wet in the studio system, so I would have some idea when I went to film school, and I would, be a little bit better informed when I started film school. And I started at Universal Studios, and I worked my way down, handing in my resume at close to 100 studios. And I say close to 100 because about 98 on my list was Filmation Studios. And I went in and said, I'm looking for a job. I have a resume and I'd like to turn it in. And the receptionist said, well, do you want a job in animation or in live action? And I didn't know anything about animation. So I said, well, I guess live action. And she said, wait a minute. And so she goes back into the building and she spoke with Arthur Nadell, who was their live action producer. And I had no idea, but this was what they called hiatus season. Hiatus season was about a 1 to 3 month period between the old shows being wrapped up, but before the networks start buying new shows. So it's like this, there's no money coming into the studio, and they keep only the people they absolutely need to keep. And fortunately for me, one of the people they absolutely needed to keep was Arthur. So Arthur's sitting in the back in his office, and he is bored out of his mind. He's got nothing to do. And she comes in and says, there's this guy looking for a job. And he says, send him in, anything to kill an afternoon. So I go back and I meet him, and we hit it off really well. And he was a wonderful, sweet guy. Very, very nice. And during the time, he asked me what I had done. I said I had been in the Army. I had just gotten discharged. I was looking forward to going to film school. And I mentioned that in addition to being a newspaper editor for an Army newspaper, I had also been writing short stories. And he said, well, if you're ever around, bring some by. I'd love to take a look at them. You don't have to hit me over the head. I go back to where we were staying. I dig them out of my suitcase. A week later, I go back and, meet Arthur again and says, well, here's a few of my short stories. And he thanks me for them. And then he says real casually, he says, we're developing a story here, a show here, and we're having trouble coming up with story ideas. And he says, I can't ask you to develop any story ideas because then I'm obligated to pay you. But if you on your own wanted to pitch a few story ideas, I'd be happy to listen. Well, again, you don't have to hit me over the head with the shovel. I go back. This time I take my typewriter out and I start typing up story ideas. And again, a week later, I come back and I drop the story ideas off. What I didn't know was that he took my short stories and he sent them by FedEx to Lou Scheimer, who was at that point vacationing in Hawaii. And 1978, FedExing something to Hawaii, that's a big deal. Okay. It's, nowadays you just send it as an attachment, but back then it was a big deal. So Lou got my short stories in Hawaii. And when he came back to Filmation Studios, he finds the premises I had written for this animated series sitting on his desk. And he got Arthur on the intercom and said, I don't know who we should hire, if we should hire the guy who wrote the short stories or the guy who wrote the premises. And Arthur said, we're the same guy. And Lou said, get him. And so Arthur calls me up and says, would you like to, write a script for us? again, yeah, sure. So I write one script, and I don't know if they put me on staff before I finished, but very quickly after I finished, I was certainly on staff. And I wrote for a number of, there are 78 shows, including segments of Tarzan and the Super 7, which included Super Stretch and Micro Woman, Web Woman, Manta and Moray. We managed to get sued by both Marvel and DC over the same characters. Both companies claiming we had ripped them off. I told Lou, I said, just tell them to decide which company we ripped off, because we couldn't rip off two companies at once. And then Filmation did not have the sharpest lawyer in the world. This is a true story.
Yeah, I heard this.
We had a series, I don't think it was that year, I think it was the next year, 79. We had a series called The Fabulous Funnies, which was a rotating series of adaptations of comic strips. And most of them were ancient. I mean, it was like The Captain and the Kids, it was Alley-Oop, Nancy and Sluggo. But one of the few they had that was more modern was a strip called Tumbleweeds, which was done by a guy named T.K. Ryan. Hilarious parody of Westerns. I mean, I loved this comic strip. It was really well done. Had this huge cast of just really oddball characters, done in a very nice, distinctive style. And when I found out we had gotten the rights to do Tumbleweeds, I campaigned really hard to write the scripts for them. So Lou gave the Tumbleweed assignment to me, and I wrote 2 Tumbleweed scripts. The first one was animated, and when we got the premiere episode, it was one of the segments in the premiere episode. And the following Monday, we got a phone call from T.K. Ryan's lawyer saying, Mr. Ryan really liked the show. He just wondered why you never bothered to get a contract with him. Because what had happened was Lou said, see if you can get the rights to Tumbleweeds to his lawyer. And the lawyer talked to Ryan, and Ryan said, well, I tell you what, have him do a storyboard. And if I like the storyboard, I'll give you permission. And the lawyer comes back and says, he says it's okay.
Amazing.
So we actually managed to get a show on the air that we had no rights to at all. And if you dig around on YouTube, you can find it, Tumbleweeds. It broke my heart because, I really wanted to do that. We could have done some fun stuff with it, but, quel dommage, as they say in France.
You have a question, James?
Oh, no, I was just laughing. Sorry.
Oh.
Yeah.
Since this is about G.I. Joe, tell the story about Deke, because this is astonishing, this story about how Deke was like buying from one guy, trying to pay that old.
Oh, my God, yeah.
That was incredible.
Deke started out as a French animation company, and they wanted to crack the American market, and they did what was it, Inspector Gadget, which actually was a very cute show. I liked Inspector Gadget. I thought it was fun. But anyway, they did Inspector Gadget, and around that time, Andy Hayward signed on. I think Jean Chalopin was the original founder of Deke, and he got Andy Hayward to come on board. And Andy started underselling. And it worked like this. A typical half-hour animation budget in those days was about $600,000. So if you wanted to do a series, especially a syndicated series, whoever was going to do the series would have to budget for X number of episodes at, $600,000. And Andy would tell people, toy companies and other people, says, oh, we can do it for 500,000. So they go, well, that's a pretty good price. We'll do that. And they would They would give him enough money to do a show at 500,000 an episode. Well, the truth was you can't do it at 500,000 an episode. It's going to cost 600,000 whether you like it or not. So very quickly they start running out of money on the show. And in addition to trying to do it as cheaply as possible, Andy now has to go out and sell 2 more shows. And he sells them at 500,000 each. And then he shaves some money off of them to pay for the first show where he's running behind budget. The problem is now, instead of having 500,000 for these 2 shows, he's only got 450,000. So now he's got to sell 4 more shows to shave money off of them to pay for those 2 shows. Now he's got to sell 8 more shows. And at a certain point, he just started flooding the market. And he was making ridiculous deals, because it's one thing if you keep the same bottom level, if you say we can do it for $500,000, but when people would get, well, we can't, $500,000 is still too expensive for us. Well, how about 375,000? Okay, we can do it for that. Well, you're not going to get the animation for 375,000. One of the last things I did in animation was they were doing a Beanie and Cecil show, and it wasn't, I don't think Deke was doing it. I think it may have been John Crispolucci. But they were doing a remake of the Beanie and Cecil show, and the same kind of ridiculous budgeting was going on. We had $50,000, if I remember correctly, to do a half-hour episode. And it was like, are you insane? $50,000 to do an original half-hour episode. And they said, yeah, so what you need to do is every time you have a character say a joke, you've got to have this freeze frame of shocked reactions from all the other characters and hold it for at least a second. So that way, every time there's a joke, there's like 3 or 4 seconds of shocked reactions, and then we go on to the next joke. Well, they never got around to animating my episode because CBS, I think it was CBS, took one look at the quality and just, they yanked the show, I think, no later than the second broadcast. They just recognized that it was a turd, and they pulled it. But that's how he did business, and he drove a lot of other people out of business. He underbid Sunbow with Hasbro and said, "Oh, I can do the G.I. Joe episodes a lot cheaper." Sure, prove that.
Yeah.
And he did that. I mean, he was flooding the market. I got a call from his studio when they were doing G.I. Joe. And they said, well, we know you were a story editor there, and we'd be happy to have you come and write some episodes for us. And I said, fine, here's my price. And they go, oh, we can't possibly meet that. And I said, well, I understand. I'm not writing for you.
So obviously he was running a Ponzi scheme of sorts.
Yeah.
I mean, did he ever even? I'm not super familiar. I've never heard this story in its entirety. Did he ever break even, or was he able to get out of that spiral? Or?
I don't think he was ever charged with anything. I don't even know if he was necessarily sued, but I am not. Is Deke still around even? I'm not familiar with him being around.
I don't think they are.
I think they definitely did some stuff in the mid to early 2000s, but I haven't seen anything recently from them. So it's been at least 15 years since I saw anything from them. So they must have eventually collapsed under the weight of everything.
I'm pretty sure they did, because you can't continually undersell like this. When we were doing animation for the networks, we used what was called deficit financing. And deficit financing would be, it cost $600,000 to do an episode. The network would only pay you $500,000 for the episode. So you would go to a bank and tell the bank, we need to borrow X amount of money to complete this series, but once the series is complete, it will go into syndication and we will be able to pay you back through syndication. And if you were Hanna-Barbera, that was extremely profitable. Filmation did well with syndication. But when the syndication market opened up, it was financed by a thing called the barter system. And the barter system wasn't invented at this time, but syndicated animation perfected it. And the barter system was basically this. Hasbro would contact TV studios, TV stations, and say, we have a half-hour show. We have, 13 weeks, 65 episodes of a half-hour show, animated show, that we will give you for free as long as we get half the commercials. And your average TV station is going, wow, half hour of free programming, good animation, interesting stories, and we get half the commercial time. We don't have to spend anything, and we can sell half the commercials locally. Okay, fine. And then Hasbro would advertise their own products on those shows. And the only rule was you couldn't advertise a G.I. Joe toy on a G.I. Joe episode or a Transformer on a Transformers episode, which explains why you're seeing My Little Pony ads in G.I. Joe. But, from Hasbro's point of view, this was an advertising expense. If to try to reach as many people with regular advertising would probably have cost somewhere in the same neighborhood. And they basically had a product that they could keep renewing again and again and again. So Hasbro, did this. Filmation did it with He-Man. All of the syndication markets use the barter system, and it worked. But again, the market got flooded. My father used to work in the garment industry, and he said the first guy to develop a particular style of clothing, he makes a fortune, and the next 4 guys that imitate him, they do well. Says, but the dozen that come after that, they're lucky to break even. And that's pretty much what happened with animation. The handful of companies such as Mattel and Hasbro that got started early, they did well until everybody and their pet monkey started cranking out animated shows. And at that point, the market is flooded. Hasbro, thinking only a bottom line, went with a cheaper company, and they saw what that got them.
Sure.
Well, they went back to Sunbow for G.I. Joe Extreme.
Mhm.
Did you work on G.I. Joe Extreme at all?
I think, yeah. They brought me back. They had what they call a bake-off, and that's basically where they ask writers to each pitch an idea for a show. And they told us that they wanted to bring G.I. Joe back. They wanted to do, what the characters were. And my pitch was, well, let's do this as a Tom Clancy story. And we'll flip it from the original G.I. Joe. The original G.I. Joe, it's Joe against Cobra, and Cobra is recognized as the bad guys. I said, we need to do it the opposite way this time. The Joes are a renegade unit that the world at large thinks are a bunch of terrorists, but in reality, they are trying to expose this world leader who pretends to be this wonderful, noble person, but he's really running a terrorist organization. And the Joes know this, and they're trying to expose him, and we just, we do it in the style of Tom Clancy. And we keep it's less fanciful, it's more intrigue, it's more action adventure, but we give them something different than what we did before. Well, Hasbro loved that idea. They hired me, They had me develop the Bible. I wrote the pilot, but then they gave me a new producer, and I will not mention her name, but they gave me a new producer who constantly undermined what I was doing. I would write something and she'd say, well, we can't have this. We take this out. We can't do it. And I said, no. Let Hasbro tell us not to do it. Hasbro won't be shy about telling us not to do something, but just let them see it. Let them decide. Don't censor yourself beforehand. And inevitably, she would force, something to be taken out of the script, and it would go to Hasbro, and Hasbro would come back. Well, why didn't you do it this way? And the way they would want it done was exactly the way I had done it the first time. We parted company. I think I did the pilot episode, and elements of things that I wrote popped up in the next 2 or 3 episodes, but I was out of the loop at that point.
Well, it's a shame that things work that way.
Yeah.
Real quick, you mentioned the syndication. At what point, just curious, at what point in the year or at what point does syndication kick in? So, for example, if season 1 of G.I. Joe started on January 1st, 1985, let's say, 60 episodes. So end of March, it does its 60 episodes. April 1st, is that when syndication kicks in, or does the syndication kick in like the year after?
Syndication, first off, you have to remember the seasons that we have in television in America, in U.S. television, are based on seasons in radio. And seasons in radio were based on school and farming. Because they knew during the summer months a big hunk of their audience was out in the fields, tending crops, doing things like this, or on vacation. So radio programs traditionally began at the start of the school year, when families would be back home and they would be likely to be listening to the programs. And then you would have your summer replacements, because they didn't have reruns on radio. I'll take that back. I'm sure you can find a few examples of where they redid scripts or where they had recordings that they played again. But for the most part, after the first season, they would go off the air and they would take a vacation, and then there would be a summer replacement that would come along. The same thing happened with television. Television fit into the same pattern, that when school started, that was the big season premieres, and everybody would make all the big hoopla about the shows. When syndication started, while there was no compelling reason that it had to start on a certain day at a certain time, they just fit into the basic pattern. So if the networks were starting new seasons in September, first week in September, the local stations would be launching their syndicated shows typically in early September. But a syndicated show could start at any time. I mean, if you were a local station and you had a show and it wasn't doing well, and somebody else said, hey, I've got 120 episodes of this sitcom, yeah, sure, I'll drop this show that's not doing well. I'll put the sitcom on, and we'll just put it on whenever we can get it on. So when syndication started, it was for G.I. Joe and Transformers. I seem to recall it was starting at the regular, beginning of the year. I may be wrong on that, but my memory is that it was around the start of the school year, which again would make sense because kids are coming home from school and they'll plop down in front of the TV set. What better time to hit them with a new show and new toys?
Sure. So then season 1 G.I. Joe would play multiple times throughout that first calendar year.
Right.
Then the moment calendar year 2 kicked in, if they threw in some syndication, that's when syndicated episodes, that's when you guys started seeing a profit and breaking the
again, we didn't see profit because they didn't view it as a profit. They didn't view the episodes as profit-making entities. They viewed them as half-hour commercials
All right.
disguised under the barter system.
Okay.
And they viewed it, instead of we're making the show in the hopes we can sell it and make money, they viewed it as we're making the show because it is cheaper to make the show and give it away for free than to try to buy advertising in all these markets.
Okay. Makes sense.
Yeah.
I like it. From a business standpoint, and then state the obvious at that point, that's $600,000. You had already made your money. So whatever
Yeah,
they did with the product,
yeah,
that's all on them. Okay.
there were no
Sure.
no residuals, no royalties. I mean, I think technically the voice actors are supposed to get royalties if the show is re-released, but that's a different thing. That was a union gig, and the unions had very strict rules about how you paid people. The animation was not done through the motion picture screen cartoonists. We used foreign animation. The writing wasn't covered by the Writers Guild or the Cartoonists Union. So there were no royalties for us. We did the episodes, we turned them in, and then that was that. So,
Okay.
Yeah, I have at least one of Arthur Burkhart's residual checks.
mhm.
It was one that was issued. Its issue date matches Alexander's birthday. So I know the voice actors were getting residuals because he's not the only one who's sold off a lot of his old check stubs. But I didn't know that from your guys' perspective, it was a one and done.
Well, it is, and this is the crazy thing, because I've got sitting on my wall a framed Writers Guild check for 13 cents for I believe it's a Chippendale Rescue Rangers that I wrote. In other countries, they have very strong writers unions, and those unions and guilds insist that every writer on a TV show be paid if the show runs in the country. And the way they computed this was they taxed VHS tapes. There was a special tax on VHS tapes. They tallied up the number of TV shows of all kinds that were shown in their country. They tallied up the number of times each show was run or rerun. And then they figured out, they just divided it up, and they figured out, okay, this person is owed $3 for their show being shown in our country. And I got 13 cents for Chippendale Rescue Rangers running somewhere. And it's sitting up there on my wall now as a trophy.
What a great cartoon.
Big money.
Did you do a lot of work on Rescue Rangers or just a couple?
I only did one. All my dealings with Disney have been abrupt. I did a couple of comic books for them when Marvel had the Disney license, because I knew the woman who was the editor. And I did a few comic books for them. Then they lost the license and she moved on somewhere else, and I didn't do any Disney stuff for a few years. And I can't remember if Chippendale came first or if the Disney magazine came first. But at some point, I think it was Marv Wolfman was editing the Disney magazine. And he said, would you like to do a Scrooge McDuck story? Well, of course. I mean, Scrooge McDuck was like one of my influences when I was a little kid. So I wrote a Scrooge McDuck story for them, and they drew it, and they paid me for it eventually. And so I've got the magazine. I can say, I've checked another item off the bucket list. I wrote a Scrooge McDuck story.
Awesome.
So,
but
Disney
doesn't come looking for me.
Buzz, do you have any? I don't know how to word this. I don't want to say regrets, but I want to say maybe things that you wish you can't go back and change things, obviously. But if you had your choice of a certain way that you would have preferred something over the way something initially actually came out and was put out on television, stuff like that, or in a book, or in a comic, or in a movie, or whatever, what thing would you choose? The one thing.
I try not to have regrets in my life. I mean, I just recognize, well, I did this thing or I did that thing, and that's what it is. The closest to that would be I took a gig on at Penthouse Comics as an editor because I knew the guy, George Kerrigan, who was the editor-in-chief. And frankly, I needed the money, and I signed on to do this, to be an editor there. And as I describe it, it was a 90-day bathyspheric excursion into the bowels of hell, because during that period of time, between the last time I saw George face to face and he asked me to come work for him, George developed a huge and uncontrolled drug habit. And it was like 90 days of literally screaming insanity. And in the end, I realized, somebody's going to jail, to the hospital, or the morgue, and it ain't going to be me. And so I just quit. And not very long after that, George took his own life. I don't want to turn this into a downer thing. I'm going to spare all the details, but if I could send a signal into the past, I would say, don't take that gig. It is not going to be worth it.
But obviously you must have learned something, got some positivity out of that choice moving forward, because in life you have to learn from your mistakes and take those things and move forward and better yourself.
Well, you do, and the irony is, there's a saying that history repeats itself. The first time it plays out as a tragedy, the second time as a farce. And following the tragedy of Penthouse Comics, my next gig was working for Stan Lee at Stan Lee Media. And Stan Lee Media was a huge stock scam. Now, Stan wasn't involved in it. Stan was as much a victim of this as anybody. But Stan had partnered up with a guy named Peter Paul. And what Peter was doing, what we would now call a pump and dump operation, which was to create a company to make it look fabulously successful, to find a bunch of chumps to buy in, and then just let the thing collapse and walk away with the money. And, there was stock manipulation going on. I lasted a relatively short period of time because I was asking too many questions, along the lines of, exactly how are we supposed to be making money with any of this? And, Peter Paul just did not want people asking that question around. So I don't regret that, because, I worked with Stan for whatever other things people may want to say. He was at least a very charming person to work with. I never had any animosity against Stan. I actually felt sorry for him, because when the company collapsed, what was happening was this: Peter Paul had two Confederates who were buying Stan Lee Media stock from each other back and forth. And every time they bought it at a higher price. So the New York Stock Exchange doesn't track who is buying or how much is being sold. They only track what the price is on what's being sold. And so every day the New York Stock Exchange was reporting, well, Stan Lee stock is trading at $17, $20, $50. And Peter Paul went to a bank and said, I'm going to remember the name of the bank in a minute. He went to this bank and said, I own X million shares of Stanley Media. I want to borrow a couple of $1 million and put those shares up as collateral. And the bank said, sure, absolutely. And so once he got his hands on the money, he told his friends, okay, stop trading the stock. And the stock nosedived. It went down from $70, it back down to 17. They stopped carrying it on the board when it dipped below, I think, 3.5. And I think the final sales price on Stanley Media stock was like 17 cents a share.
Wow.
Jeez.
And this happened in less than a week's time. Okay,
Wow.
That's how fast this thing collapsed.
That's gutting.
Friends of mine who were still working there said they had just bought this big Spider-Man statue to put in the lobby, for Stan. It was a prefab Spider-Man statue made out of fiberglass. And they had just unboxed it when Peter Paul let them know, hey, we're bankrupt and we're filing for bankruptcy. And if you haven't cashed your check, tough.
Wow.
And all they could do was just put the statue together for Stan and, let Stan see it before the doors were locked.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So
Not
I
a
want
Spider-Man.
to. Oh, sorry. Did you have something, James?
I was being silly. I said amazing, and I said not in the Spider-Man sense.
Yeah.
Oh.
Heyo.
So I want to thank you, Buzz. If you would like to say anything to the fans that are watching us on this episode, you can do so. We very much appreciate hearing your stories and the time that you've taken to tell your stories with us and answer questions for us. I love hearing the different things that you have to say because it's just fascinating to me.
Thank you.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you.
All I can say to the fans is thank you very much. When I was a teenager and involved in science fiction fandom, the EC Comics bullpen, even though they were like 15 years before, the EC Comics bullpen was still legendary and still talked about. And as a young teenage fan, I always thought to myself, I hope someday I can be involved in a really cool project with a bunch of really cool people and we do something that's remembered for a long time. I got my wish. I thank the fans for enjoying my work.
One more, if you don't mind me asking.
Sure.
Kevin Smith just kind of continued the Filmation story for He-Man, Masters of the Universe. Transformers definitely pulls from the Sunbow era story. If the powers that be reached out to you and the money was right and you could get the team back together, which property would you maybe do one more season on? And
Well,
don't let the G.I. Joe fan club bias.
Okay. First off, too many of the team are no longer with us, unfortunately.
Okay.
We don't have Wally. We don't have a number of the voice actors. Steve's no longer with us. Marty Pasco. We had a lot of people, really good people. I hope this doesn't sound discouraging, but it's been my experience. You can't recapture the old gestalt, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
Which is not to say that a new project couldn't be just as exciting, just as much fun. But I have learned professionally when I'm done with something to put it down and walk away from it. And I never second guess the people who came after me, who continued it. The Most Dangerous Man in the World was an exception because I had already blocked the story out and I really wanted to tell it. And if I would not have done it if there hadn't been the Kindle Worlds project. And when the Kindle Worlds project was ongoing, I thought, well, I can publish this and I can get it out to an audience. I would never have done it on my own as fan fiction, if that's the question. So at this moment, I don't know. I won't say, I'll never say never, but I would have to hear what it is they want to do and what they would like to do. They might, you know, you could come to me and say, we've got a really interesting take on Gem and the Holograms. And I might go, well, son of a gun, you do. That sparks some ideas. Let's talk. On the other hand, if they were just to say, we're only interested in reiterating the same kinds of stories you did back in the mid 80s, I'd say I am no longer in that mindset. And when I did The Most Dangerous Man in the World, I had to do a huge amount of research just to get the vehicles, you know, right, their names, what they could do, things like that, because I owe it to the fans to be as accurate as possible. But I had been out of Joe World for a couple of decades at that point. It was no longer fresh in my head. I didn't have a thick notebook with all the specifications. So it was an effort to write The Most Dangerous Man in the World. So,
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Hopefully that comes to the light of the day.
Again, if someone wants to talk to me about it, I'll be delighted. We can, you know, I won't say, you know, like I said, never say never, but, you know, if they only want to get the story and hire someone else to script it, we can have that discussion. If they want to talk to me about scripting it, that's another discussion. Just, you know, call me. I'm not impossible to find.
No, you've been very, very open and very easy and accessible to reach from my perspective anyway. I know you're very out there in the community, the Facebook pages, and you answer questions to people. You're very, very amenable from everything that I've seen, and there's not a lot of people like you out there that you can just broach and ask a question. Hey, what about this? Or hey, could you do an interview? And you're pending your schedule. You're willing.
Why would I not be thankful and respectful to the people who gave me a career and who remember me fondly at this time? I know there are some creators who are introverts and they don't like socialization. I understand that. But I mean, for heaven's sakes, we wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't for the fans. And so the very least I can do is acknowledge that and, you know, share what I can with them.
Well,
we can't hear enough, so thank you.
Thank you very much again for your time. I want to let the viewers know the G.I. Joe Fan Club Live is extra content on the G.I. Joe Fan Club Facebook page. If you have any questions or would like to suggest ideas, you can do so below. And this is going to also be aired on the G.I. Joe Fan Club YouTube channel. I will also like to thank Brian Sauer, who is doing our graphics, who is also helping with editing and technical background on the G.I. Joe Fan Club Live. I want to thank my two co-hosts, James Kavanaugh Jr., Jason Morrell, and my special guest, Buzz Dixen, again for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me on.
It was an honor, Buzz. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Have a good night.
Good night.
Take care. All right.